Welcome to Executive Protection Insights, and I'm Liam. I want to start today's episode with a question. When does an advance actually begin? If you've been in executive protection for any length of time, you've probably heard someone say, the advance starts when the advance agent lands. I hear that all the time. And every time I hear it, I know I'm talking to someone who probably hasn't spent much time leading complex international operations, because the truth is very different. Your advance doesn't begin when your aircraft lands. It doesn't begin when you walk into the hotel. It doesn't begin when you shake hands with the local security manager. It begins much earlier than that. It begins the moment an executive assistant forwards you an itinerary. That itinerary is one of the most underestimated documents in executive protection. Most people look at it and see flights, hotels, and meetings. I look at it and see risk. Every line raises a question. Every meeting creates movement. Every movement creates exposure. And every exposure has to be managed. I still remember an itinerary I received for a CEO who was scheduled to visit 3 countries in 1 week. On the surface, it looked like an ordinary business trip. Monday in Sao Paulo, Tuesday in Buenos Aires, Wednesday and Thursday in Santiago. Home on Friday, the executive assistant even included a note that said, "Everything has been confirmed." I remember laughing to myself, not because she had done a poor job. She was actually one of the best executive assistants I'd ever worked with. She had confirmed the meetings, the hotels, the flights, the dinners, everything. But what she had confirmed wasn't the operation. She had confirmed the schedule. Those are 2 completely different things. I printed the itinerary and put it on my desk. That's something I still do today. I know we all live on laptops and tablets now, but I still like printing an itinerary. I want to circle things, highlight them, write notes in the margin, ask questions. Within 5 minutes, my clean itinerary looked like someone had attacked it with a red marker. The first thing that caught my attention wasn't the destination, it was the timing. The CEO was landing in Sao Paulo at 8:10 in the morning. His first meeting was scheduled for 9:30. Whoever built that schedule had looked at the flight arrival time. They hadn't looked at the operation. Now, if you've ever landed in Sao Paulo during a busy weekday morning, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. You don't simply land, jump into a vehicle, and drive away. First, the aircraft has to arrive on time. Then comes immigration, then baggage, then customs. Then the airport meet and greet, then vehicle loading. Only after all of that do you actually leave the airport. And then you still have Sao Paulo traffic. Suddenly, that hour and 20 minutes between landing and the first meeting didn't look generous anymore. It looked impossible. Now imagine you're the principal. Your aircraft lands 10 minutes late. Immigration takes 25 minutes instead of 10. One check bag doesn't appear immediately. By the time you leave the terminal, you've already lost 45 minutes. Your executive assistant starts apologizing. The local office starts calling to ask where you are. The client is already waiting. None of this is a security problem, but it becomes an executive protection problem. Why? Because pressure creates bad decisions. Someone inevitably says the words I hate hearing. Can't we make up some time? No, not safely. You can't make up 30 minutes by driving faster through downtown Sao Paulo during morning rush hour. You simply arrive 30 minutes late. That's reality, and reality always wins. So before I looked at hotels, before I looked at drivers, before I called a local provider, I picked up the phone and called the executive assistant. I asked a simple question. Can we move the first meeting to 10:30? There was silence. Then she asked me why. I explained every step from aircraft door opening to vehicle departure. She hadn't considered any of it. Not because she wasn't competent, because that's not her job. Her job is scheduling. My job is operational reality. Within an hour, the meeting had moved. Nothing else changed. The CEO never knew the conversation happened. And that's exactly how executive protection should work. If your principal notices all the problems you solved before the trip even begins, you've probably solved them too late. The next thing I look for is movement, not meetings, movement. People often think executive protection is about protecting people. In reality, it's mostly about protecting movement. Hotels don't create much risk. Driving between hotels and meetings does. Conference rooms don't worry me. The 45 minutes it takes to get there worries me. Restaurants are rarely the issue. Walking from the vehicle through an uncontrolled entrance can be, every movement deserves the same question. How many options do I have? If the answer is one, you don't have a plan. You have hope. And hope isn't an operational strategy. I once reviewed another itinerary where someone had scheduled lunch on one side of the city and an afternoon meeting on the other. Google Maps estimated 28 minutes. It looked perfect, except the meeting happened to be on the same afternoon as a major football derby. Half the city was closing roads. Police were creating security perimeters. Traffic patterns changed completely. Google Maps didn't know that. The local police certainly did. That's why I always tell younger agents something that took me years to learn. Google Maps tells you distance. Local knowledge tells you reality. That's why your local driver matters. That's why your local security provider matters. That's why relationships matter. I remember sitting with one of our local drivers over coffee after an advance. He looked at my route package for the following day. Everything was correct. Every route had been surveyed. Every ETA had been calculated. Every contingency route had been identified. He looked at me and smiled. Don't use Route 2 tomorrow. I asked him why. He shrugged. The president is speaking nearby. That wasn't in any intelligence report. It wasn't on the news. There wasn't a NOTAM. There wasn't a police bulletin. He simply knew. Because he lived there. That's when I learned one of the most valuable lessons of my career. Never underestimate local knowledge. Sometimes the most valuable person on your advance isn't another protection agent. It's the driver who's been driving those streets for 20 years. Or the hotel security manager who's worked every major international delegation. Or the concierge who quietly tells you the front entrance becomes chaos every afternoon at 5. Experience lives everywhere. Your job is finding it before the operation begins. By this point, I've probably spent 2 or 3 hours reviewing nothing more than an itinerary. I haven't booked a flight. I haven't selected a hotel. I haven't even opened a map yet. And yet, the advance has already started. Because planning starts with questions, not answers. The better your questions, the better your operation. Every itinerary should leave you curious. Why this hotel? Why this route? Why this meeting time? Why this airport? Why this restaurant? If you stop asking why, you've stopped advancing. And that's usually when operations begin surprising you. One of the habits I've developed over the years is something I call building the operational picture. Notice I didn't say the travel picture. I didn't say the executive's schedule. I said the operational picture. Because that's how I want my brain to see the mission. Not as individual meetings, but as one continuous operation from the moment the principal closes the front door of his house until he walks back through it several days later. Everything in between is connected. The flight affects the arrival. The arrival affects the motorcade. The motorcade affects the meeting affects the lunch affects the afternoon movement. The afternoon movement affects the hotel arrival. Nothing exists on its own. One delay can ripple through the entire day. That's why experienced advance agents are constantly asking themselves one question. If this changes, what else changes? It's a simple exercise, but it completely changes the way you think. Let's say the first meeting runs 45 minutes over schedule. What happens next? Does lunch disappear? Does the second meeting have to move? Does the principal now arrive at the factory during a shift change with hundreds of employees leaving the site? Will the afternoon traffic be different because you've now entered the city during rush hour instead of before it? Have you just lost daylight for your evening movement? Does your advance at tomorrow's venue now have to happen after dark instead of in daylight? One small delay, 10 operational consequences. This is why I often tell new agents that executive protection is less about reacting to problems and more about understanding how problems travel. Because they do. They travel from one movement to another until someone stops them. Another thing I always do before the advance is identify what I call the decision makers. This sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how often people don't know who actually has authority. Who can approve changes to the itinerary? Who can cancel a meeting? Who speaks directly to the principal? Who controls the local drivers? Who owns the aircraft schedule? Who has the relationship with the client? Those people become critical the moment something changes. I once worked with a multinational company where everyone assumed the executive assistant controlled the itinerary. She didn't. The regional vice president did. Every request had to go through him. We discovered that before the trip started. Imagine finding that out while your principal is sitting in the back of the vehicle waiting for a decision. That's not the time to learn how the organization works. Another question I always ask is whether the itinerary reflects how executives actually behave. Because executives are human, and humans don't always follow schedules. The best example is dinners. An itinerary might say dinner ends at 9 o'clock. Really? Based on what? If your principal is having dinner with a head of government, a CEO, or an important client, there's a very good chance nobody is looking at their watch. The conversation finishes when it finishes. I've seen dinners scheduled for 90 minutes last almost 4 hours. I've seen factory visits that were supposed to take 45 minutes turn into half a day because the principal became interested in the production process. I've also seen 30-minute meetings end after 10 minutes because everything had already been discussed during a phone call the previous week. That's why I never become emotionally attached to an itinerary. It's a living document. It should evolve. If your itinerary cannot change, your operation is probably too rigid. One thing that concerns me every time I review an itinerary is dead time. Those empty spaces where nothing is scheduled. At first glance, they look relaxing. They rarely are, because someone always has an idea. Why don't we stop here? Let's grab a coffee. I've heard about this restaurant. My friend is nearby. Every one of those spontaneous decisions creates a brand new movement that nobody advanced. Some of the most complicated moments I've ever managed weren't the meetings we'd planned for weeks. They were the 5-minute detours nobody expected. That's why I always ask the executive assistant a simple question. What usually happens during the gaps? Sometimes the answer is nothing. Sometimes the answer completely changes the operation. Maybe the principal likes to go for a morning run. Maybe they always visit the hotel gym. Maybe they prefer walking to dinner if it's close enough. Those aren't details, they're operational information. One of my favorite questions to ask a principal, when the relationship allows it, is this. Tell me about your travel habits. Not your preferences, your habits. There's a difference. Preferences change. Habits rarely do. A principal may tell you they prefer a particular hotel. That's useful. But if they tell you they always like arriving 30 minutes early to every meeting, now you've learned something operationally valuable. If they tell you they hate waiting in vehicles, you'll plan movements differently. If they tell you they always stop for coffee after landing, you've just identified another movement that should probably be advanced. Good executive protection isn't only about understanding threats. It's about understanding people. The longer you do this job, the more you realize you're protecting behavior just as much as you're protecting an individual. By the time I finish reviewing an itinerary, I already have pages of notes. Questions for the executive assistant, questions for the client, questions for the local office, questions for the transportation provider, questions for the hotel, and that's exactly what I want. If your itinerary doesn't generate questions, you're probably not looking closely enough. Young agents often think experience means having all the answers. I found the opposite to be true. Experience means asking better questions. You become comfortable admitting what you don't know. You become curious. You stop making assumptions. Because assumptions have a way of becoming operational failures. Before I end today's episode, I want to leave you with one final thought. When someone emails you an itinerary, don't look at it as a schedule. Look at it as the first chapter of the operation. Because that's exactly what it is. Everything that follows. Your protective intelligence, your hotel advance, your route reconnaissance, your medical planning, your venue surveys, your motorcade planning, your contingency plans will all be built on the quality of your understanding of that one document. Get the beginning wrong, and you'll spend the rest of the mission trying to catch up. Get it right, and the advance almost begins to build itself. The principal will probably never know the amount of work that started the day that itinerary arrived in your inbox. The executive assistant may never realize how many questions you quietly answered before anyone boarded an aircraft. Your client may assume the trip simply ran smoothly. That's okay. In fact, that's exactly what we want. Because success in executive protection is often invisible. The best operations feel effortless. Not because they were easy, because someone spent hours asking questions long before anyone else thought they needed to. The next time an itinerary lands in your inbox, don't rush to book flights or reserve hotels. Pour yourself a coffee, print the itinerary, pick up a pen, and start asking questions. Because that itinerary isn't the beginning of someone's business trip. It's the beginning of your operation. Until next time, stay sharp, stay prepared, and stay operational.